I'm calling these predictions. That doesn't mean that they're guarantees. We all know that there are lots of things, lots of variables, things that could change even after we do this live session today. I am not an expert on all of the things that we're going to go through. However, in the 15 plus years that I've been at this, there are a lot of patterns that we're seeing in the market right now. And I think a lot of positive opportunities that are there for us as well. That being said, let's go ahead and dive in. Here's a little outline for the presentation section for us today. I'm going to go ahead and give you the 5 predictions. So I'm not going to bury the lead on this. I'll give you the 5. Then I'm going to kind of rewind a little bit and give you some foundational elements that impact buyer demand, some trends in seller supply, and some interpretation about what we're seeing in most markets in the 2 of those things. Then I'm going to come back to the 5 predictions and give you, at least from my perspective, what I think are some of the bigger opportunities for Q4 and into 2024 based on those predictions. As I'm sure you can appreciate, with the amount of time that we have together today, we won't be able to go like super in the weeds on all of the stuff that I love to nerd out on, and maybe some of you do as well. Then that'll get us to the live Q&A. You'll also see a little disclaimer note here at the bottom of this slide. We pulled a lot of material for this. We've done our very best to cite the sources on the slides, and we'll also do so in what we send out to you after this session. I would very much encourage you to cite the sources if you decide you want to use this. NAR has some very specific guidelines for citation of sources with them. So I just wanted to make sure you know that my job here today is to accumulate a lot of data from a lot of really smart people, to give you sort of my interpretation of it and what Debbie and I and the other coaches on our staff sort of see as coming down the pipeline. So without further ado, let's just go straight to the 5 predictions. And here they are. The first prediction is, I think in the vast majority of markets, transaction count has found a bottom, and we're likely going to see modest gains in 2024. In most markets, if you're sort of trending along with the national numbers, your transaction count is down about 20 to 25% this year compared to last year. We all know a lot of the reasons why. However, it is very unlikely that we have another leg down on transaction counts. In fact, I think we found the bottom and are starting to turn our way modestly off the floor there. The second, mortgage rates are pretty close to their peak, would be my best guess, maybe already at their peak. And we're going to see those settle into around 6 to 7% as a range for most of 2024. I have a lot of different data points for you when we get to that. Number 3, baby boomers. They are going to continue to have an outsized impact on the market, both through the cash purchases that they're continuing to make and the impact that they're having in migration, particularly from the Northeast to the Sun Belt. However, I'll show you some examples of other areas that's happening. Number 4, hold and rent it with a move up, I think is going to be the best strategy for your local sphere and your past clients. And then number 5, in many parts of the country, inventory is going to continue to be a challenge for years, emphasis on years to come. So there are your 5 predictions. If that's what you came for, we'll see you next time. Thanks for being here. If you'd really like the details behind it, buckle up. Here we go. So here's the backstory. Those of you who have been around us for a while know that we're really big about creating like base cases and models through which to run things. It gives us a filtering mechanism. Some of you have even heard me talk on this topic before. At the end of the day, though, in order to be able to, with some degree of accuracy, predict the direction of your real estate market, all you really have to do is understand the relationship between what's happening with buyer demand and what's happening with seller supply. Now you know that, and here are the nuances of it. The first piece you've got to pay attention to is the impact of net migration. Are there more people moving into your area or more people moving out of your area? We've got some great data for you on that in just a second. Sort of nestled underneath that, the impact of jobs and economic development. Undoubtedly, we've seen that slow down a little bit over the past 12 to 18 months. Yet there are still really strong underpinnings in the job market, which we won't have time to get to today. However, overall, still very positive. Number two, demographic waves, particularly the habits of millennials and baby boomers. I think the boomers are going to continue to be the story, at least in the near term. However, we also want to be mindful of the impact that millennials are having in your markets. And then number three, federal monetary policy. And those sort of take on a couple of different forms. Interest rates obviously have been the topic of the past year plus. And then to a slightly lesser extent, tax incentives and sort of federal programs and the impact that those have. So if you're looking for a way to read the news, to read the headlines, and to ask yourself the question, what impact might this have on the market? Here's some niche kind of ways to do that. Lots of interpretation coming for you. I'm just giving you the framework right now. Let's talk net migration. A lot of this is stuff you probably instinctively know from operating in your markets, yet most of you have heard me say before, the things that we can show people, they will begin to understand. If you were to make some, maybe a couple of notes here, I think one of the traps a lot of agents fall into is they get into the business of just telling their prospects or just telling the people in their sphere what's happening in the market versus actually showing them what's happening in the market. What you see here is a slide that was provided via NAR and some research that they did. The underpinning research on this is postal service data, so zip code change of address forms. And you'll notice the blue zones are all places of high inbound migration. The red zones are all areas of high outbound migration. Probably not surprisingly for most of you, based on who's on our meeting here live, you'll notice that the top 5 states in inbound migration, Florida, Texas, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and then also Georgia, seeing some really positive numbers as well. Not a surprise to you, and I think that trend is going to continue to accelerate. I'll give you some interpretation on maybe what you should do about that as we move along through today's segment. The second piece we talked about on the buy side was the impact of millennials and baby boomers. And this is a really interesting trend that you can see accelerating. I'll just kind of annotate a little bit of this for you. I want you to look here. This blue line is millennials. And this is percent of buyers who are millennials. And then this yellow line here is boomers. And look at what's happening with this trend. And if you think a little deeper on it, it probably doesn't surprise you. This is the impact that interest rates are having on the buying power of millennials and how comparatively less susceptible boomers are to that. So not to give away too many secrets, because we're going to get to this toward the end, this should be an indicator that more of your efforts are going toward boomers and their patterns, at least in the short term, than millennials and their patterns. Gen X here, pretty well stable, maybe just a slight downturn here because of the impact of interest rates. Speaking of interest rates, let's talk about some forecast predictions. And I put up here for you a number of different sources, and these are, unless otherwise noted, 2024 30-year fixed averages. So this is not where it's going to be on January 1. It's not necessarily where it's going to be at the end of the calendar year. This is where each of these firms see mortgage interest rates averaging throughout the calendar year of 2024. And you'll note that it's a fairly wide range. I was a little surprised to see this 4.9 and this 5.0 on the low end. And then you'll see pretty much everybody else clustered here around 6. Obviously, this is not an all-inclusive list. However, my interpretation of the people who are kind of on the lower end of that range might be those who are still anticipating that perhaps the Fed might overshoot in their raising of interest rates, cause a little bit more of a recessionary feel than what they're looking for, and then have to counteract that by lowering rates even more toward the back of the year. I think it's a very difficult game to get into accurately predicting interest rates, because you've heard the phrase data dependent, and you've heard the Fed talk about data dependent so much that I don't know that they could even tell you where they think rates are going to be or what they're going to do with rates over the next 12 months. So it's a moving target. I just like looking at ranges. I like looking at averages. I think we could all agree that things that have a 6 or a 5 handle in front of it are more stimulative to the real estate market than the things that have a 7 or perhaps even a higher first number on it. This is probably a good slide to put in front of your buyers as well. So let's dig into a little bit of math. Some of you know me pretty well and know that I'm a math nerd, and I'll do my best to kind of breeze through a concept here with you, and why I believe now, counterintuitively, is a fantastic time to be a buyer. So I'm going to say that again. I think right now, counterintuitively, is a fantastic time to be a buyer. And you may be thinking, well, hang on a second, Bill. Mortgage interest rates are really high. Affordability's running away from people. And I don't disagree with any of that. I would say, though, and this is, I think, a good conversation to have with some of your more serious and certainly financially qualified buyers, is the emotion that's in the market right now feels a lot more like a buyer's market type emotion than it does a seller's market type emotion. One of the guys we follow is a guy named Mike Simonson from Altos Research. And I was watching some of his content recently, and he made what I thought was a great point, where he said people are being more reactive to the changes in rates than the absolute value of those changes. So what I hear in that is it's more of an emotional reaction to rates with a 7 in front of them than it is the absolute value of those changes. And it is, as you all know, within that, when emotion disconnects from the actual of the market, there's an opportunity somewhere in there. And if you can identify that opportunity, and a certain group, in this case of your buyers, says, and I'll be slightly exaggerant for effect here, because I know every market is different. If I, as a buyer right now, have higher negotiating power because the buyer pool is pretty small comparatively, if I, as a buyer, think, okay, all these really smart people think rates are going down, well, what do we think is going to happen when those rates go down? Well, of course, all the people who are sitting on the fence waiting on rates to come down now start to get off of the fence. Imagine with me for just a minute, knowing what you know about buyers in today's market, that we looked up 6 months from now. This is not what I'm predicting. However, just hypothesize for a second with me. And we ended up in rates that kind of look like this number, or even this number that's got a 5 in front of it. If you woke up tomorrow and the 30-year fixed was at 5 something, there would be a flood of buyer activity in your market, which would then drive prices up. It would make it more difficult for your current buyers. It becomes even more firmly a seller's market than the inventory number would give you right now. So let's go back and connect some dots here real quick. If people are being emotional to the changes in rates more so than the absolute value, what does that mean? I just took a $500,000 loan amount, pick whatever number you want to, ran it through an amortization calculator. And the question that I really wanted to solve for here is, what's the difference in the interest amount in the monthly payment between, say, like a 7%-ish and a 6%-ish? And you can see here that this is not, even in this example, a significant difference. So that looks like, I don't know, let's call it roughly $400. And you might run this for any serious buyer that you have who you know has some financial means, yet they're just hung up emotionally on what's going on with rates. And you might say, okay, so it's a $400 interest difference, back of envelope math. How long do you think they would either be in that house, and or how long do you think they would have that payment before rates would come down and they could refinance? And we could speculate on a whole bunch of different things there. Let's say I was being really conservative, though. And I said, okay, they're going to be in that spot for 3 years before they can either make a decision to refinance, because all rate projections point downward from here, or they're going to end up selling it and going somewhere else. And you guys can see where I'm going with this. If you ran out 3 years worth of payments at $400 extra per month, that's going to get you to some number that's not super significant. And I would argue that you could negotiate your way to a purchase price lower than the actual list price of the property that would more than make up for this number, not even taking into account the appreciation that the person is likely to see if you're in any of those states that are seeing the net inbound migration. So let me hit pause here for just a second, because I don't want to over-explain this, yet I think this is a really important point. What your buyers are freaking out about is this. What they are not paying attention to or haven't looked closely at the numbers are the differences between these numbers. The difference between these, or the difference between these, or even the difference between, say, like this one and this one, are insignificant relative to the purchase price of their house. If you took nothing else away from today's conversation, I would want it to be that most of your buyers who are waiting on rates are going to wait through what is probably one of the best opportunities for them to get a great house at a fair price, because they're too emotionally hung up on these numbers right here. I'm going to pause for a second, kind of let that sink in, and then we're going to talk about the seller side of things. I was chatting with one of our clients earlier today, and we were discussing how I believe that we're going to look up 6 months from now, and buyers are going to recognize that they missed the opportunity to get a great house in a market that's operating like a buyer's market, even though it's technically a seller's market. All right, let's keep moving. We got the buyer side, buyer demand, migration, demographic waves, interest rates or their impact, the emotion of versus the actual numbers of. We got to go play the other side, though. Trends in seller supply. This is a little bit trickier because there's only a couple of places that this can come from. It can come from resale homes, or it can come from new construction. And on the resale side of things, if you're in an area that has higher net outbound migration, then this story might not be super great for you. The good news on this is that we're not seeing such massive amounts of inventory in a lot of parts of the country like we did in the last downturn, that you're seeing a collapse in pricing. Yes, there are markets that have pulled back, and some of those were because they got way too overheated over the past 5 years. And in others, unfortunately, there's the net outbound migration. Most of you who are on this live right now are in markets that you're seeing the higher net inbound migration. So you still have more consistent buyer demand than you have good inventory coming to the market. Nationally, those numbers are kind of the same too. We are still technically in a seller's market nationally at 2.9 months versus the most recent NAR report. And some of your markets are still seeing numbers much lower than that. Even if you've seen inventory growth over the past 12 to 18 months, you're still technically in a seller's market and low inventory. New construction, short-term trend, National Association of Home Builders is still predicting housing starts down double digits in the current calendar year and recovering into 2024. That trend is kind of accelerating in the back half of the year as builders are doing more build-to-rent type programs, or they really tapped the brakes earlier in this calendar year when there was much more concern about recession versus soft landing. And now the most predict that we're leaning much more heavily towards soft landing than big time recession. You're seeing those builders ramp back up. The long-term shortages I'm going to talk about a little bit later, because that's a 5 to 10 year trend where we're still significantly underbuilt as a country. Again, you're using these as filters for how you're going to read or interpret the news. What's happening right now, does that create more resale inventory in my market? What's happening right now, is that creating more new construction inventory in my market? And if you can always sort of be looking at things through the lens of what impact does this have on buyer demand? What impact does that have on seller supply? Is it making any meaningful changes in the relationship between those two? And if it is, we definitely want to stop and pay attention. And if it's not, we want to be careful that we and our clients aren't getting caught up in the emotion of what the headlines are doing to us. Here's a couple little things for you that I think are interesting. This is from NAR's most recent economic forecast. What you're looking at on the left here is inventory of existing homes. And so this is total supply of inventory in the US. You can just see this general trend, like even if we go back to when this market really began heating up, which was back here. So you'll see general trend line, though, of existing homes for sale down, and then minus this little over here on the right, this is new homes, minus this little COVID blip here, and then where they pulled back earlier this calendar year, you'll still see this general uptrend here. And the thought here is that you're going to start to see this number climb as we head out into 2024. I will draw your attention to the fact that this number is much, much lower than this number. This tells all of us that there's a lot of opportunity in new construction. Many of you are already pursuing this. We'll talk about opportunities in resale in just a second as well. Just look, though, at kind of the absolute relationship between these two graphs over time, where you've got this is doing this and this is doing this. Side note, it's also why a lot of your really good home builder stocks have performed super well over the past couple of years. All right. Now we're going to get into, these are the 5 predictions, and then here's what we should do about it. So now we're into some of my interpretation of what's going on. I'll go through these 5, and then we'll open this up for some Q&A. So the first prediction was that transaction count is bottom, likely see modest growth in 2024. Down roughly 20%. Here would be an interesting exercise to do for homework. Over the past 12 months, is your business up, down, or sideways from a units standpoint? Most of you have seen some good growth in your average sale price, which might be giving you a little bit of an illusion there on the unit side. So you might say, if you're in a market where your units are down 25%, and you go look at your numbers and you're down 10%. Okay, when a vacuum down 10% year over year in units, probably not the way you drew up your business plan for this year. However, there's a silver lining, and the silver lining is that if your market is down 25% and you're only down 10%, then technically you've outpaced the market. Technically, you've gained market share. Now, even better if you're flat or up, and we have many clients who are in that position. We have many clients who are having the best years of their careers right now, in spite of the fact that their markets might be down 20 to 30%. That knife kind of cuts the other way, though. So let's say your market's down 25% in units, and you're down 40% in units. I certainly wouldn't wish that on any of you, and at that moment, it's no longer just a market force. It is a market force plus something that we did or didn't do. The wind was blowing hard in our face, and rather than holding the line or pushing harder through the wind, we got pushed back further. For many of you, you'll be entering business planning season here very soon, and this is an important number to look at. So that's you evaluating your business relative to the market trends over the past 12 months. I would say don't expect your transaction count in your market. Yours can go wherever you choose for it to go. Don't expect your transaction count in your market to return to the levels that we saw when mortgage interest rates were 3 or 4%. I don't think it's a stretch to say that we might not see that transaction count in a given year. We might not see that transaction count again ever. both because of what we'll talk about in inventory in a minute, and just how stimulative interest rates and federal monetary policy were in roughly that 2-year window post the introduction of COVID. So what I'd like for you to do here is, as you get into business planning, make your adjustments to your activities and your strategies, expecting that your market is not going to see significant unit growth over the next 12 months. So what might you do in order to accomplish the goals that you're set out to accomplish? I also put a note in here about fluff, and I think all businesses accumulate a little bit of fat, and all businesses accumulate a little bit of dead weight. This is a great time of year to go in and be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Yet I would bet if you went through your bank statement or your credit card statement or both, you're going to find a couple hundred, maybe a couple $1,000 a month in just accumulated fluff. Really good time to go trim that. Not in a scarcity mode, just in like it's extra stuff. Get rid of it. Here was prediction number 2. Mortgage rates near their peak, should be in a 6 to 7% range. And I already gave you kind of the big opportunity for buyers and the window that's there. This is, I got to tell you guys, this is the piece that the buyers who are in your pipeline and the people in your sphere of influence, they don't know this because they're bought into the headlines. Cut through the headlines and share with them the opportunity that's there. I'm sure we're going to get some questions about that in Q&A. Here's some fun facts about baby boomers, and this is through a number of different resources that we will link to. 50% of boomers are cash buyers. And you know that probably just experientially from your work, particularly with relocating boomers, yet the stereotype is they've been in their previous home for a long time. They've accumulated a lot of equity in that. They're selling it. They're taking that equity. They're rolling it into the purchase of what will be probably their last major home purchase of their lives. And then they're using that as a competitive weapon to win if they're in a multiple offer situation. The other interesting thing on this is the median distance that people move. Now, hang with me here for just a second. Historically, and this is not just boomer related, this is for all, how would I describe this? Repeat buyers. So this is not a first-time buyer number. This is their second, third, however many home that they bought. So for the repeat buyer of any age, historically, the median distance they have moved has been 10 to 15 miles. That's taking into account people who are moving across town and people who are moving across country. Over the past 2 years, that number has grown significantly, and it is largely due to relocating boomers and to a lesser extent, major corporate job relocations. Let's stick with the boomers though. So you've got 50 miles, you got 90 miles, and then 25% of buyers moving 450. So here's what that means. Of all buyers, the median distance they moved when they bought in the past 2 years has been 50 miles. For repeat buyers, the median distance is 90 miles. Now, keep in mind, this number historically is 10 to 15. And then for those buyers, 25% of all buyers moved more than 450 miles. Now, you already know, and I just want to connect this dot for you. If the next 5 to 10 years, a large segment of our economy, real estate economy, is going to be shaped by boomers who are moving from other parts of the country and bringing their cash with them. If your business right now does not have a lead generation and marketing pillar for that, you are losing ground by the minute. As you get into Q4, as you get into 2024, as you think about your business 5+ years into the future, this has got to be an area that you're playing. The numbers are too strong in this. There's 70 million plus or minus boomers in this country right now, and most of them are in this phase where they're making their last real estate related decisions. Great long-term trend here. Okay, let's talk non-boomer, although I suppose this could be related to them as well. The hold and rent and move up, I believe, is the best strategy for your local sphere of influence and your past clients. So here's the setup. You have somebody who is roughly in their 40s to 50s. they bought their family home sometime in the past 5 years. Interest rates were great. They're locked in on that. They're the people you've heard me call the happily stuck people. They like their house. They don't have a compelling reason to move. They don't want to give up their interest rate. And I think there is a percentage of them, and some of you have already seen this, who, let's say they've owned their house for the past 5 years and they've seen 50% plus equity growth. And along the way, they refied into a 2.75 on a 15-year fixed. It'd be really easy for that person to sit back and say, why would I ever sell this house? And the answer to that for most of them is they should never sell it. Because as an investor, which maybe they're not right now, however, if they begin thinking this way, as an investor, they have sort of fallen into one of the best things that can happen as an investor, and that is to have very low cost, long-term debt. So if you've got people in your sphere of influence who own property, basically anything below about 5%, I'll give you some data on this in just a second before we wrap up. From a wealth building standpoint, their best strategy is going to be to hold that house, to rent it as a long-term rental, to take the spread on the difference between what they can rent it for and what their payment is on that really low rate, and use that to allow them to move up into something else. And that net positive cash flow is offsetting the fact temporarily that they are paying a 7% interest rate versus something lower than 7. So they're going to get the cash flow to help absorb the payment, to be a buyer in a market that's behaving emotionally like a buyer's market, to get a better house for themselves now, keeping house number 1 as an investment property. Then they're going to go refi house number 2 in a year or 2 or 3 as rates retreat back to historical norms in the direction that people think they're going. Now, I know the strategy is not going to apply to everyone. I'm not suggesting that everyone should do that. Every situation is different. And I would bet that there is a certain percentage of your Met database who has decided that they're going to stay in their current home for the rest of their lives because they've not considered this wealth building strategy that we're talking about. The reason I think that's even more true is, and this is an NAR number, they asked the question in their profile of home buyers and home sellers to people who have recently purchased, how long do they expect to stay in their home? And the median answer to that question is 15 years. Now, if you've been studying these data for a long time, like I have, you know that historically that number is somewhere around 7 to 10 years. It skews a little lower for younger buyers and a little longer for older buyers, yet normally that median number is 7 to 10. It's now 15. So I want you to look at those happily stuck people and at least have the conversation with them about using their current home as a wealth building vehicle as they look at acquiring other properties. You're going to add a lot of value to folks, even if they don't decide to do anything with this information. This is not something that most are going to arrive at on their own, and it's not something you're going to hear a lot in the headlines either. The fifth and final market prediction before we turn it to some Q&A, I mentioned the inventory remained low and a challenge for years. Roughly 2 years ago, NAR commissioned a study by a group that basically sought to answer the question, do we have enough houses or not? And I don't have time to elaborate on this other than to say that they found that as a country, we are underbuilt by roughly 5.5 to 6.5 million units. Said a slightly different way, if we were to achieve inventory balance in our market right now, we would need 6 million more new construction units. How long would it take us to get there? I'm going to bounce for a second. Now, this is technically not apples to apples because this is available inventory versus housing starts. I'll draw your attention to, though, this number here is roughly 400,000. We won't do the exact math on that. However, you could take 5 to 6 million and divide it by 400,000 and solve for the question of how many houses per year would we have to build, and then how many years would it take to get there? And the answer to that is roughly a decade. So we're talking about here at best 5-year, at longest 10-year trend where we're going to continue to be underbuilt as a country. That's why inventory is going to remain a challenge. That's also why things like land acquisition, your relationships with builders and developers, those of you who are investors who might do spec related stuff, or you might work with some of the smaller home builders, that's why that opportunity is there. The other reason, and this goes to the happily stuck people and resale inventory, and this was from some data we were looking at from Morgan Stanley, 79% of current homeowners, and this is of their primary residence, have a fixed mortgage interest rate below 3.75. So if we didn't run this, how do we help our happily stuck people get unstuck? And they sat back and said, we love our house and we love our interest rate. What percentage of those people are in that bucket? These data would suggest that roughly 80% of primary homeowners are in that spot, which then means we've got to get really creative in finding motivated sellers. And this will be the final point I'll make, then we'll go to Q&A, is we know historically there are certain reasons, life circumstance related reasons, that people move. They get married, they have enough kids that they outgrow their house, they get relocated for a job, they get divorced, there's a death in a family, they relocate to chase the grandkids. You're looking for ways to say, where are these motivating factors within my sphere of influence? How could I use the people that I know to find more of those people? So you might take everyone between the age of like 25 and 45 in your sphere of influence and find out if their parents are still alive and in what part of the country they still live in, because that represents some inbound migration opportunity. And if you're not already thinking in this way, I'd like for you to get really, really purposeful over the next 90 days or so about building those different pillars within your business. Because if you're someone right now who is largely sphere of influence and past client based, awesome. And statistically, roughly 80% of those people are not going to do anything in the near term. So the good is there's a lot of opportunity out there. The challenge is you're going to have to find it in places probably other than where you're used to looking. You can check out a lot of resources that we built for you at middletonelitecoaching.com. And if you're interested in learning more about what we do, you can find us there. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.